Okay, this is my first video ever talking about the books that I love, the books that I've read, reviews, rants, all that good stuff. So I thought I would start with just a casual video topic, nothing too high stakes. And that topic is my favorite books of all time. Casual, right? So the first book I'm going to talk about is perhaps my first favorite book. I didn't always like reading as a kid. It's something that I slowly grew to enjoy, and I think the first book that I was ever obsessed with that became an integral part of my personality and that I read so much that the cover came off is Tithe by Holly Black. I read this book for the first time when I was 14 and loved it. I'm still a huge Holly Black fan. I have a few of her books here. I actually just read her Folk of the Air trilogy, so The Quill Prince, Wicked King, and Queen of Nothing, and I loved them just as much. Anything that is set in Holly Black's world, I will read. But Tithe holds a very special place in my heart because it was the first book of hers that I ever read. So often, but not always, Holly Black's books are set in a low fantasy world, which means that it is in the real world, but there are magical and fantastical elements. And those elements are the existence of fairies. These are not the fairies that we see in Disney movies. These are fairies that are influenced by folklore, by places, like Ireland and Scotland and Wales and England, where we see fairies in a much more brutal way. They're cruel and cunning and immortal. So their wants and desires, their morality is not like ours. And this book involves a girl being kind of dragged into that fairy world, to that dark world. And the title, I don't want to tell you too much, but the title Tithe, if you know anything about what tithing is, I only learned about it when I was reading this book and my dad saw the cover, that tithing is something that often happens in religions. So you would pay a certain percentage of your income to the church, and that was your tithe for the year. Now, the tithe in fairy world isn't paid in money. It's paid in flesh. So every 7 years, there needs to be a human sacrifice in order to keep the borders up, in order to keep the rules in place, in order to keep the magic flowing and everything balanced the way that it is supposed to be. So that type comes into play in this book. The number one book that I recommend to people who have mostly only read YA fantasy and want to get into adult fantasy but are maybe a little worried that it's a lot, it might be intimidating, things like this, I recommend The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. Now, Jemisin is a new favorite author. Every year, I pick an author and I read all of their books, their entire backlog, everything. And I've pretty much already decided that for 2022, that's going to be N.K. Jemisin. I already have a couple more of her books right here. The Broken Earth trilogy is excellent. It has won like every award out there. Every single book in that series won the Hugo and the Nebula, which is like the highest prize in fantasy and science fiction. But they are a little bit heavier. Now, if you read this book and you like it, definitely try those out. But this was N.K. Jemisin's debut novel. And I think because of that, she makes it a little bit more palatable and easier to read. And it has a lot of elements that are really good for getting you into fantasy. There's some political intrigue. There's a decent amount of characters, nothing crazy like Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, those kind of books. And there's a little bit of romance, but it's not the main focus of the book. That tends to be what I like. I like a book that has romance, but I don't want it to be the whole plot, and that's this book. So really easy to read, really, really great intro to fantasy. I don't want to say too much about it. The political intrigue, I guess, that's happening is a battle over the throne, classic. But the thing that makes this different is that there are gods walking among the royals that live in the royal palace. And there's multiple gods, so think a little bit like Greek mythology, or more so Egyptian. Like, I get very much like Egyptian vibes from this book. So it's really, really good, perfect intro to adult fantasy. Now, to get away from fantasy a little bit, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is, I think, more and more so becoming regarded as a classic. Either way, it's definitely literary fiction. It's not a long book. It's very easy to read. Easy in the sense that it's readable, not easy in its content. So for anyone wanting to read this book, I would definitely let you know about the content and trigger warnings. There is a lot to do with mental health and depression and suicide and self-harm in this book. That's something that you should be aware of going in. I would always recommend that you're in a decent headspace before you read this book, because even if you are in a good headspace, it is challenging. The subject material is hard, but so amazing. It's so beautifully written. I mean, Sylvia Plath is also a poet, so you can be pretty much guaranteed that what she writes is going to be really beautiful. She has one analogy in this book. It's the analogy of the fig tree, where she describes the place that she is in her life as though she's sitting under a fig tree, and all of the fruit hanging from the tree are possibilities for her life, different things that she could do, different choices that she could make. And just know that that analogy, when you read it, is so poignant, I feel, to anyone, but especially people in their late teens, 20s, early 30s, like these times of life where you're making huge decisions, where all of a sudden you have to, make these decisions that are going to affect the rest of your life and are really intimidating and really scary. That analogy is absolutely beautiful. This book is also semi-autobiographical, so if you know anything about Sylvia Plath, I would read this first and then dive a little bit into her life. I'm the kind of person who very much likes to separate author from text. If you've ever read the essay Death of the Author, it tells us that stories, once they enter the public sphere, can be interpreted however the reader wants, as long as they can back it up with evidence from the text, so that it doesn't matter what the author meant for you to interpret their work as. You can interpret it however you want. But there is something really amazing about reading a story that is semi-autobiographical. So to read about her life and to see that influence in this book, and then to find out what happened in her life after this all happened, because this is only up to a certain point in her life. I will also go on record by saying that Ted Hughes is an asshole. Another classic that I really, really love is Emma by Jane Austen. Jane Austen is actually the author that I picked this year to read all of her works. I had up until this point only ever read Pride and Prejudice, and of course I love Pride and Prejudice, who doesn't? But it gets so much attention, it gets a lot of love for good reason, but Emma is so lovely. It is so, so, so lovely. So if you're interested in Jane Austen's works, this one was probably the most enjoyable one to read. I would highly recommend watching the film adaptation. I personally love the 2020 adaptation. I know lots of people love the Gwyneth Paltrow one. Watch both. Watch whatever you want. But the 2020 version was really, really true to the book, except for a few things that honestly I'm kind of glad that they changed, and I plan on doing a dedicated review of all of Jane Austen's books once I finish them all at the end of this year. And that one will be full of spoilers, so I can talk about the things that they changed that I like that they changed. But it's definitely one of her more readable books. I think it's one of the books that stands the test of time better than something like Mansfield Park. And if you want to read any classics, any historical fiction, I think this is a really, really nice one to read. One book that I really, really love that is set in my home province of Newfoundland is Galore by Michael Crummey. I love this book so much. It touched a special place in my heart because even though I've read a few books set in Newfoundland, and I plan on reading more, Michael Crummey is a Newfoundland author, and he says most, if not all, of his books in Newfoundland. I haven't gotten a chance to read any of his other books. I plan to, but I can't imagine loving a book any more than I love this book. I think it appeals to a lot of things that I like about Newfoundland culture, which is the influence of folklore. So Newfoundland is a very, very Irish population. I know I don't have the accent, but that's because I grew up in town. But that influence is still there and was still a part of my growing up. And the landscape, the being by the ocean, going around the bay to visit my grandparents, and hearing about our history and our culture is so meaningful. And this book spans quite a long time. So it starts in the mid 1800s, I believe, when a whale washes up on the shore of a fictional outport community called Paradise Deep. And a man is pulled from the belly of this whale. And the book follows over 100 years of him and the characters in that community that he interacts with. And not so much focuses on him, but focuses on the families that he interacts with. There are two main families in this book. There's quite a few characters. They do provide a character index. I read a lot of fantasy, so it wasn't that bad to me. Like, it was just a 2-page character index, but for some people, I had a student return this book to me saying, I can't read it, there's too many characters, but they're all really interesting and have their own amazing stories to tell. Other things that I love about this book is the magical realism influence, and not just him being pulled out of the belly of the whale, but just this like feeling of mysticism that runs through it. If you don't like magical realism, if you don't like fantasy, it is a very mild touch of it. So maybe if you were interested in, getting into that a little bit, this would be a good book for you. It's much more historical fiction and character driven than anything else. This is a very, very character driven novel. And I love it so much. Another book that also has an influence of magical realism that I love so much. I don't have my physical copy of it right now because I lent it to someone because I love it so much and I want everyone to read it. It's called The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender. And the magical realism element in that book is that the main character, Ava Lavender, is inexplicably born with the wings of a bird. So she looks kind of like an angel, and that symbolism comes into play in the book. But besides that, it reads much more like a contemporary. So again, if you're more of a contemporary reader, that would be a book that you could definitely enjoy. And if you're someone who likes more magical realism or fantasy elements, there's a little bit of that as well. Again, I will give content warnings for sexual violence in this book. It's not a huge part of the plot. Like, it's not like running through like mental illness is in the bell jar, but definitely something to be aware of going in. This book is, again, a book that is so beautifully written that just like touches a part of you, and I think so many people could enjoy. I think it's very much something that young people could read and would resonate with them because there are a lot of young characters, but I think it's something that adults would love just as much. Another classic that I would recommend is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I think if you want to get into reading classics, Oscar Wilde is a really good place to start. Again, he's very readable. He doesn't write, huge tomes. This is quite a small book, but writes so beautifully. Reading this book, I'm not someone who annotates my books a lot or highlights them. I like to keep them pretty pristine, and sometimes I'll put some tabs on them or something, but generally speaking, I don't want to write in them or mess them up or anything. But this book, I could not go more than a couple of pages without having to find a pen or a highlighter to underline or highlight some sentence, because the things that Oscar Wilde says are so freaking beautiful. Like, when you're listening to a stand-up comedian and they make a joke and it's so true thing where they point something out that seems so obvious and it's so funny to you, and it almost makes you laugh more that it never occurred to you how funny that is, or just the way that they said it made it so much funnier. To me, that's what Oscar Wilde does, but with the most devastatingly beautiful things. Like, he'll say something and it just hits. You're like, wow, I agree, and I never would have said that or been able to say it as beautifully as he did. Let's, as a experiment, I'm just gonna flick through this and see if there's any line. Okay, first page that I found that has a quote on it. So, just at random. I have given away my whole soul to someone who treats it as if it were a flower to put in his coat, a bit of decoration to charm his vanity, an ornament for a summer's day. I thought that was really amazing and really beautiful, especially in the context of this story. So this book is great, very easy read, great classics recommendation. Really hope that if you haven't read it, that you will. Okay, and finally, this is currently my favorite book of all time. I read it 2 years ago, and it has yet to be dethroned. And that book is Circe by Madeline Miller. I've read Song of Achilles. I love Song of Achilles. It devastated me. It is my boyfriend's favorite book that I've ever made him read. And I'm making him read a lot of books. He'll read all of these at some point. But Circe hit so different, and it was because of her. It was because of this strong female protagonist that affected me in a really deep way. I am not the kind of person who needs to relate to a character in order to enjoy the book. In fact, I find there are things about characters that I relate to on some level or have things in common with them. But generally speaking, I don't relate to a lot of the characters in books I read. I don't even have to like them. Like, some people, can't read a book if the the character is, too whiny or too angsty or too flawed and all of these things doesn't really bother me. And I'm not saying that I relate to Circe on some level, I understand her. Not necessarily. I relate to her flaws, to the struggles that she has, to the feelings that she has, to some of her feelings of isolation, to her feelings of jealousy. And I just loved reading about her world as she saw it, about her world through her eyes, and finding out all of these flaws, but then also the wonderful things that make her the person that she is and make her the really human character that she is. Because if you don't know, Circe is a god or demigod in Greek mythology. So if you enjoy Greek mythology, this will be a really fun book, and there'll be lots of little tidbits of information for you. But yeah, this book is so good. Such a great female lead. Again, beautiful writing. Madeline Miller, I will read anything you write from now on. I trust you. So please, please keep writing. And please, everyone, read Circe. Okay. Those are currently my favorite books of all time. I expect them to change. I hope that 2 years from now, Circe isn't my favorite book, because I want to read a book that hits me the way that this book hit me. But I love all of these books, and I don't expect that to ever change. So if you have read any of these books, I would love to know what you thought of them. If you disagree with me, I would love to hear that too. And what your favorite books are, because I'm always looking for recommendations. So hope to hear from you, and I hope that maybe you will read some of these books as well.